All right, hello folks. Welcome to another Monday pairing stream with James Shore.
Hi, everyone.
So this is episode N. I don't remember what.
I think it's 15. I think we're up to 15.
Wow.
Yeah. But we seem to be getting to the end, maybe, of this particular project.
End.
What'd you say? Yeah, end.
Yeah. So which means there's another beginning, perhaps.
Yeah, perhaps. So for those of you who are just joining us, we're working on this program called Yacht, which is a website that plays Yacht dice game that's a lot like Yahtzee, but not trademarked. And apparently Yacht came first. Is that true? Did Yacht come before Yahtzee?
Yeah, there's all sorts of variations. Yahtzee spelled differently, and yeah, from what I remember when I was researching this on Wikipedia, it's been around for a while, and Hasbro marketed it, and hey, they did a good job.
Yeah, they did. So yeah, I think there's a lot of parlor games that got turned into official games that were like just games people played for years and years, decades. But anyway, so what we've been doing is we did all the Nullable stuff in the first 13 shows or so, meaning that we converted the production code to be nullable so that we could turn it off in production. And that was useful. We have not actually ever had a reason to turn it off in production, but it has been very useful for our tests.
Yes.
I actually, having done this for quite a while now, I do find uses for this in production, but I'll admit the most valuable purpose of the Nullables is to make tests easier to write and easier to write sociable tests.
Mm-hmm.
But what we did last week is we started looking at, well, let's look at A-frame architecture. A-frame architecture is an alternative to hexagonal architecture. And if you want to bring up your
yes, the diagram,
your thing, it's basically a simpler way of doing the same thing that hexagonal architecture is trying to do. It wasn't actually inspired by hexagonal architecture. It was inspired by, I don't know if it has an inspiration. It comes from the same source that hexagonal does and functional core imperative shell does, which is that fundamentally it's hard to test code that is a mix of infrastructure and logic. And so the idea is let's separate our logic out. And A-frame architecture.
And in fact, that's what I've termed sort of all these architectures as separation of concerns architectures, and each one is different and more restrictive or constrained or specific, and others are a little looser. So, but yeah,
I would agree with that. Hey, Suiji, welcome. So, and I think the way you do hexagonal architecture is more strict than sort of the by the book hexagonal architecture, although by the book hexagonal architecture is actually kind of hard to come by.
It's not well specified. And like Alistair doesn't talk like, I don't know. I love Alistair. I think he's done a lot of great things. I just find some of his talks to be hard to understand. Like when he's actually describing it, it's one of those where if you come up with a really small toy example, it's not very illuminating because especially something with like hexagonal that has a lot of parts to it. It doesn't really. It looks like pointless separation until you start really looking at what does this mean for testability, which I think like you, that's how I was attracted to it. But I feel like I've added on to it. But like what is by the book hexagonal? I don't think there is one, or it's insufficient to be by the book because it's under specified.
Yeah. So the difference I think between A-frame architecture and Alistair's hexagonal architecture, which is a bigger difference than between my A-frame architecture and your hexagonal architecture. But the difference between A-frame architecture is that it's very strict about a few things and a lot less strict about other things that hexagonal is strict about. And the one thing that A-frame architecture is strict about is it says that you're going to divide your application into 4 parts. You're going to have the traffic cop stuff, and that's called application/UI layer. You're going to have wrappers for anything that talks to the outside world or receives information from the outside world, and that's going to be called infrastructure. you're going to have, and then everything else that never talks to the outside world is called logic.
Mm-hmm.
So application UI talks to the outside world by using infrastructure. Infrastructure talks directly to the outside world. Logic doesn't talk to the outside world. And then we have values, which are just value objects, data structures that are shared concepts used by everything.
Right.
And the one hard and fast rule, the only hard and fast rule in A-frame architecture, is that logic is unaware of infrastructure and infrastructure is unaware of logic. And that's why we have the application UI layer, because there's some stuff that needs to be aware of both, and that goes there. And the decision about what to put in application UI and the decision about what to put in logic, it's sort of like do whatever's easiest and nicest. There's not really any rules around that. And in today's world, there's some programs that a lot of line of business type of stuff that really is just coordinating between a whole lot of services.
Yes.
And that side of that kind of code, it may not have a logic layer at all.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
There's really the only one rule in A-frame architecture, and again, that's that infrastructure and logic are unaware of each other. And you can break that rule just by not making logic, because the rule 0 is do good design, whatever that means for you and your team.
Yeah.
I think the contrast between A-frame architecture and Alistair's hexagonal architecture is that Alistair's hexagonal architecture doesn't make that strong distinction between infrastructure and logic. It does have I don't know if you want to bring up your hexagonal diagram. It does have the concept of these adapters, which are what I'm calling infrastructure wrappers. And it has this idea of ports, which are interfaces to those adapters,
right,
which don't exist in A-frame architecture because they're not necessary when you're using nullables. But in hexagonal architecture, they're the way that you stub out or mock out your infrastructure. And another major difference between hexagonal and A-frame is that hexagonal has what you call, I think by the book, it's called left and right ports.
Well, by the book, it actually has two names. One comes from Alistair's work on use case, of which is primary and secondary.
Primary and secondary. That was it. Yeah, not left and right.
Yeah. The other is driving and driven, which I like in isolation. Like, I like this idea that the actors drive the application. The problem is then you have driving on the left side and driven on the right, and those are words that are too close to each other, which confused me when I was learning it. So that's where I finally settled on the terminology of inbound versus outbound. Just to show sort of from the point of view of the center of the application, is it something coming in and triggering that behavior, or is it now I need to go and do something with the outside world, whether it's fetching or notifying?
Right. And that distinction doesn't exist in A-frame architecture. There's only Zool. There's only the things that, another reference half the people aren't going to get. There is only infrastructure wrappers, and an infrastructure wrapper is responsible for some piece of external state. And whether it's, getting events from that external state or writing to it or doing both, it's not relevant. Rule 0, do good design.
Right.
So, break that up however you want, but A-frame architecture doesn't say anything about it. And this, of course, is relevant to today's stream, because what we've been doing, what we did in the last stream, is we started to look at your hexagonal architecture and said, well, how can we change this to be an A-frame architecture? And because your approach to hexagonal does make a sharp distinction between infrastructure and logic, there isn't necessarily a lot to do there. Like, I don't know that we're going to make the design better. But one thing that I spotted last time that we were going to explore was that you have made a split between your game service, which is application code, and your game model, which is logic code. That, again, following rule 0, do what's easy, may be easier if those combined back up into the application layer. And that's what we started to look at. At the end of the last episode, though, the main thing we were doing is just trying to get the database, the revised, the persistence code, which used to be in memory,
Right.
getting that hooked up, and that
Right.
wasn't quite done.
Right.
So today, I think what we're going to do is we're going to finish hooking up the database, and then we'll look at combining game and game service, see where that takes us. And I figure we've got between 1 and 3 sessions left today, maybe next week, maybe the following week.
Mm-hmm. And
then we've probably milked everything we can get out of Yacht.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's some things we could do to Yacht to sort of push it, because right now I think we've made it only one game. Whether we want to make that multi-game or not, multi-simultaneous game, we could think about, what would that sort of expose or be interesting from a design standpoint. But yeah, other than that, we might have milked it for all it's worth.
Yeah. I mean, I have to admit, leaving it with having just the one game as what it supports does feel like, oh, that's a really toy example. It'd be nice if it did support multiple games. At the same time, I don't know that it's going to teach us anything new,
right?
Because I think that might just be some drudgery. So Ted and I have been talking, to all those of you watching, Ted and I have been talking about, well, what do we want to do next? And we have some ideas, but we'd like to hear from you. Like, what would you like to see us do next? And if you're watching the recording, you can tweet us or Mastodon us. Boy, that's an awkward phrase.
Yeah, that's really.
Anyway, it's I'm at James Shore or at James Shore at mastodon.online, and Ted is at JitterTed on Twitter, and I don't remember what your Mastodon handle is, Ted.
It's also JitterTed, but it's at sfba.social. And you can if you can't find us, you can probably leave a comment on the video, or I'm sure you'll be able to find us on Twitter. If you search for James Shore or for JitterTed on any of those, you'll find us.
Yeah. So but also those of you watching now, as thoughts come to you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat. What would you like to see us do next? We've explored a bunch of ideas, but we don't really have anything specific in mind. We just want to do something that would be interesting to folks and to us.
And to us, yeah. Got it. I mean, it's got to be interesting to us. I mean, I think we can find interesting things to talk about in a lot of, in sort of a lot of areas. But I think having something compelling would be nice.
Yeah. I imagine whatever we do will involve a lot of design, and will involve test-driven development, and of course, it will involve pairing.
Right.
So, other than that, is there technology that you're interested in? Is there a challenge that you're interested in? Let us know. Yeah. And with that, should we get back to our databases?
Yeah. So, all right. Let's go here.
Okay, so it's been a whole week, which means I have no idea where we were on this exercise. Do you remember?
So all the tests are passing. So let's go look at.
Oh, I remember. It's in GameService. And if you scroll up to the very top, we are still using in-memory game repository up here.
Right.
And I think the next thing we were going to do, we had tried YOLOing it, and it failed once again.
Right.
We had tried changing that to GameDatabase and seeing what would happen. And as I recall, what we were going to do next is we were going to make in-memory game repository. We were possibly going to store an instance of GameDatabase in there so that, because the problem is, that's all coming back to me now. The problem is in-game repository is a fake. It's storing the data and then retrieving the data.
Right.
But our game database is a nullable, which means that it does not actually have the ability to store data when it's nulled.
Right.
What it has is the ability to configure what response comes back, but that is completely independent of what's being stored because it does not try to simulate the real behavior. It just allows the behavior to be specified in the test. So what happened is when we changed this over, you did have tests that relied on the fake simulating real persistence.
Yes.
So when that stopped, it started failing.
Right.
And so if we now that these have a, I think Suiji suggested something last time, and I think it might be a good idea. If we make a shared interface on these, we can go through test by test and change each usage from in-memory game repository to game database. So that's what I'm thinking on this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so we had gotten rid of the interface that the repository was implementing. Now it's just the in-memory, and so
we'd gotten rid of the old interface, and what I'm suggesting is we make a new interface because game database. One of the things we did last time is we changed the in-memory game repository signatures.
Yes,
to match game
up.
database.
Right. Yeah.
So now we can extract a new interface from this, just temporarily, so that we can use either a game database or an in-memory game repository inside of GameService, and then we'll be able to gradually migrate from in-memory game repository to game database.
Right.
And then when that's done, we can erase the interface.
Yeah. I think that works. So let's go extract interface.
I think all we need is save and load, right?
I'm just looking to see. Yep, those look the same. Whoops. So we want to.
I always like to use delete me when I've got something truly temporary. Suiji asks, would that be a version of branch by abstraction? I don't know. I'm not sure if I know what that is. Like, I've heard it before, but I've never taken the time to study the pattern.
Okay, so that was actually the wrong thing to do. So what I wanted was to take this, extract the interface here, and replace usages with the interface.
Right.
And then we'll replace that interface with a game database. Okay. So let's, what's going to go away? Does it matter?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a delete me impl. Make it a really horrible name. So let's see. And game database should now be able to implement
It's in-memory game repository. Let's rename that to be something else because that's not really it.
How about that? All right.
So this should all still pass test, right?
Yep. Check run. Yep. It's all good.
What's your take on Suichi's question in the chat?
I always forget what branch by abstraction is.
Oh, that was my answer. I thought you'd have it. I thought you'd had it. You're a little more up on patterns and terminology than I am.
There's some of those where it's just like, it's probably one that I don't, where the name doesn't. So there's some pattern names that the name doesn't work in my brain. Another one is tell, don't ask, or. And
no, that's the one.
And that always confuses me because I'm like, wait, I don't like to what it just doesn't fit my brain for what it represents. It's like, oh, okay, but that's not what I would call it. Because I always think about commands and queries as the two types of methods, and querying is asking. And so I'm like, why wouldn't I want to ask? Of course I want to ask. And so that's why in my brain, there's some of those pattern names that just my mental model just rejects it from connecting to anything. So I avoid talking about it.
What I try to do, I mean, there are a million patterns, there are a million refactorings. And I don't find memorizing those names super useful. So I don't. What I try to do is when I come across a new pattern or a new refactoring, I try to look at it and say, well, what is the underlying principle that this is going off of? And that's really where I direct my mental energy is. How does this stuff work? And then in the moment, I will make up a refactoring or an approach that comes from that underlying philosophy. So for design, it's cohesion, coupling, once and only once.
Right.
Those are kind of like the big three principles. And then for refactoring, it really is about make the thing look the way you want it to look, and then move it or extract it or do something else.
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing here is we're making the thing look the way we want it. And then we're going to, gradually do one at a time. But ultimately it's about that. It's how can we take small steps?
Right.
How can we turn this into a shape that we can do one piece at a time?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, occasionally I'll come up with, sort of a meta refactoring or refactoring maneuver, which is sort of a bunch of small ones. But it's all that. It's sort of like, I think one of the hardest parts about the refactoring sometimes is sort of visualizing or picturing or having a sense in your head of where you're trying to head to, what's your target, and building up that ability to say, okay, I know where it is, and then I know where I am, and then being able to then break down the steps to get there is, I think, the hardest part. And some, I know I've talked about it before, and I'll spend time practicing that. I did a whole stream a few weeks ago of just, here's where I want to get to. Can I find a better way? Can I find a better path? And that's how you learn is that, practicing and trying out different things, and then building up that internal pattern catalog of how to get there.
Yeah.
Hey, hi, Edgar. Thank you for the tier 1 sub. Appreciate that.
Charlie Pancakes mentioned Flyweight. Good to see you, Charlie.
So Flyweight I actually know offhand because it's one of those where it's like, show me a current usage of, there's a bunch of those original patterns, right, that were done in the 80s and 90s. And it's like Flyweight is one of those, it had a very specific usage, and that's one of the ones that I rarely encounter in sort of modern development.
I have never used Flyweight, but it's exactly, so I read the original design patterns book, which is interesting because I don't know that it really reflects the spirit of what the Hillside group was doing with patterns back in the day, because it's very, very implementation specific. It's very, very low level. But I wasn't part of the Hillside group, so I don't know. But I see things like Ward Cunningham's pattern. Oh, what was it? Well, he had a couple. He had episodes, which was basically early XP-ish stuff. And then there was, there's another one that he has that I refer to all the time, but I can't remember it now.
Whole value?
Yeah, it has whole value in it.
Checks? Is it part of the checks?
It's the checks pattern language.
Yeah.
And you read those and you're like, wow, there's some really smart stuff here. And it's like, I can see how I could apply this anywhere. Whereas I read the design patterns book, the Gang of Four book, I was like, oh God, this is like 300 pages on how to do polymorphism. But Flyweight stuck with me because it wasn't polymorphism. It was actually one of the only ones in that book that wasn't just another example of having an interface with multiple implementations.
Right.
So that one, Charlie, I actually do know, because even though I've never used it, like I've never had an occasion to use it.
Yeah, I mean, there's some where I use it all the time and don't even sometimes think about it. You know, certainly like strategy, even state I'll use on occasion. But then there are others like that. In the early days when I first read the book, I read it. Joshua Karyevsky and Rob Me and a bunch of us in New York were reading it back in part of the design pattern study group, which I think is the best way to learn a lot of this stuff is in a book club of some sort. Yeah. And at the time, some of it fit fairly well because I was doing desktop app development in Java, and so a lot of the stuff that those patterns came from were desktop GUIs. You know, those deep, heavy, parallel hierarchies I've only found them in desktop GUIs. I don't see that pattern anywhere else. And so,
there was this whole thing about, because desktop GUIs in the 90s were the big thing, right? Yeah, I think some of the work of the Hillside group was studying various ways people had done desktop GUIs, and that's why I think we saw a lot of patterns come out of that.
Yeah. But yeah, like prototype, I know what it is, but I wouldn't use it outside of pretty much desktop GUI. Same thing for Flyweight and some of the others.
So let me see if I've got this right, because I'm sure that some of our listeners have never heard of Flyweight. As I recall, and it has been probably a couple of decades since I've looked at this, but as I recall, Flyweight was the one where you basically have one implementation, like one concrete implementation that's used by a whole bunch of different people rather than multiple instances.
Yeah.
Is that it? Yeah,
and the idea that it always gets, whatever method you're calling on, it always gets called with some kind of environmental context, like where is it? But otherwise, it's almost this immutable thing that will represent itself differently depending on the context it appears. The prototypical example they used is basically text layout, right? The lowercase letter t, it knows how to display itself, and so you don't need to have separate copies of that if it's some complex rendering kinds of things. But the idea is you don't have to have lots of copies because it doesn't hold the state. And so what's sort of the underlying pattern, what's really interesting is it's about like immutability and how you can sort of extract things to be immutable. And that makes it easier to reuse in a lot of different situations, as long as you pass in some kind of context or sort of where is it being used.
It's funny you mention that, because like I said, I don't think in terms of patterns. I try to think in terms of underlying principles. And one of those underlying principles is that immutable state is easier to work with than mutable state. And I have, I was a big early adopter of object-oriented programming. Like, I loved object-oriented programming, and I still have a soft spot in my heart for object-oriented programming. But and I also believe that most people who work in object-oriented languages don't know how to do object-oriented design. But one thing that I have found is that as I've matured over the decades, that I want to do less and less object stuff and more immutability.
Mhm.
And I'll still put that in an object structure. I like the encapsulation of state and behavior. That to me is the most valuable thing about objects.
Yes.
But I've absolutely moved away from implementation inheritance. I've absolutely moved away from mutable state. And modern languages with their generational garbage collectors can create short-lived objects very cheaply.
Mhm.
So I will just duplicate an object and have it be immutable in a way that previously I'd be like, well, that's not object oriented. It's objects have state and they
Right.
mutate their state. So I don't know where I'm going with that. It's, I guess, you talked about immutability and flyweights.
Yeah,
I guess I kind of do that all the time now.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I sort of, I still love OO, and I still, I'm okay with mutable state, but I think restricting it, reducing it, makes multi-threading, concurrent programming easier in languages like Java, because then, it's not a problem with if you have multiple threads running. It's when you have multiple threads trying to change state at the same time, and so if you can minimize that. Or potentially eliminate it, then you get all your parallelism and or concurrency for free.
I like that. I've been working in JavaScript for quite a while now, and concurrency is much simpler in JavaScript because of the threading model, which is basically handed off to the environment.
Right.
A lot of people are surprised to hear that JavaScript does have multi-threading in the most popular environments, which is Node.js and the browser. But they're very rarely used because they're not necessary in most cases.
Right.
But if you're curious, look up web workers and worker threads in Node.js. That's how you get threads. But what I find that immutability gives me is that when you have mutable state, it is possible to have sort of this stuff changing out from under you at a distance.
Right.
Like, I'm going to call this thing, which is 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 going to change some state. And then way back over here in a completely another part of the program, my state's changed out from under me and I didn't realize it.
Mm-hmm.
Immutable state means that if I've got something, it's what it always was. Like, I
Right.
never have to worry about that. And
Right.
I find that really valuable in terms of simplifying. For me, the hard part in understanding the code is understanding what's going to happen. And if my mental model can say, well, if this thing is this here, then it's always this, then that makes it much easier for me to reason about.
Yeah, and what's interesting is a lot of the desktop apps had to worry about that kind of thing much more than I think sort of modern web server development. Like, we look at the yacht, even though there's only one game, it's never holding on to that yacht in memory for all time.
Right, because HTTP is inherently
stateless. Exactly. Yeah. And that's kind of forced some of these, which I think is why, like Node.js is popular, because it works with that paradigm.
It does.
And that's where, like, I just think about things that made sense in the early 2000s or late 1990s, some of the, Hibernate and so on with complex, dirty checking and all this kind of stuff. It's like, just stop worrying about that and just load in immutable things. And occasionally you'll have to change something. And then sort of the problem shifts a bit to the distributed databases and all those problems of a distributed system, but that's fine. I mean, that's at least you're not fighting that stuff in memory.
Well, what I like about the web model as opposed to the desktop model, which you're right, it does have persistent state, whereas the HTTP is stateless. What I like about it is that it's obviously we still have state, right. But now the state management is explicit.
Right.
Now, as we are going to do. Now, when we pull something out of the database, we have to say, pull something out of the database. And when we want to write back something to the database, we have to say, now write it back to the database. And I think that makes the reasoning much simpler.
Yeah.
So you finished modifying this, so we've got the shared interface. Now we should be able to find its callers and just go through them one at a time, right?
Yeah. So one of the ones is here, and so we should be able to replace this then with game. I mean, you should probably replace the whole game database.
It should just be game database.
Yeah. And then create null. So let's see what happens.
By the way, while you're doing that, I'm going to repeat the announcement we made earlier because we've got more folks watching now, which is that we are coming to the end of our work on Yacht, and Ted and I are interested to hear what would all of you like to see in terms of what do we work on next. We're thinking we're having a lot of fun doing this. We'd like to keep doing it. We're thinking about continuing to do it, and love to hear what your thoughts are. Are there technologies you'd like to see us work on? Types of problems, like for example, a specific database or specific programming language or specific front end framework. Are there types of problems that you'd be interested in seeing us work on, like legacy code or desktop apps or command line apps or something like that? Anyway, share your thoughts in the comments, or if you're watching the video, send it out to us via one of the many ways you can contact us, which you can find by Googling us. You found it.
So this I think is one of the places where it's well, let's see it. Actually, I'm not sure why this failed. Is this failing because I'm not sure why this is failing?
We'll go ahead and put it back. Let's take a second look at it. So before we just had the pure, and you're sure that was working?
Yes.
Okay.
So, probably because when it does the assign, I think this is a case of a fake versus a nullable. It does an execute and save and then does a load.
Oh, okay. So that's...
Hey, Wheatlol, thank you for the 7 months.
So that's an interesting issue.
And so when it did the load game, that's where...
Why is it doing a load game there?
Because it offloaded the execute and save to the thing that does the load.
Execute and save does a load game. Oh, you know what I think that's for? That's trying to manage the IDs, which we don't have. So I don't know that we need to do that.
Yeah, so the thing is though, this code should work. And so I'm a bit reluctant to change the code just because Nullables don't support it.
Well, it works, but it's redundant. Like, I look at that and I say, well, why are we loading the game before we're saving it? Or after we save it? We still have the game.
Well, this method has the game locally.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right that it does this partially because the save game might assign an ID, which you're right.
It doesn't. I mean, we know it doesn't because there are no IDs.
Right. But I'm curious, like, let's say execute and save did something and the database did something that we'd have to reload in order to look at it.
I mean, that would be a weird design.
Is that too arbitrary of a thing?
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't design my code to work that way.
So I could inline the execute and save here, and then that would get rid of it.
I mean, I think in both of those cases, we could just delete the load game. It's a no-op. well, it's not a no-op, it costs performance, but we've got a game on line 91.
Well, so let me posit a different hypothetical. Let's say we did have IDs. What would I'm curious what you would do. Right. So the save game.
I think we should like actually do that. When when we do it, we'll do it. But if we actually had IDs, then I would put them in the game memento. And then I would populate it on load, and I would populate it on new.
Populate it. I guess what I'm getting at is I'm trying to understand how because in my other applications IDs do get assigned upon save, so I'm just curious how if I want to.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't do that. I would probably make it. I would have GameDatabase have 3 methods: save, load, and create. And create, because the only time you need to create the ID is when you're inserting a new row, right? Mm-hmm. So I would make that explicit. I wouldn't have it be a side effect. So save would fail if there was no ID, and create would probably just save, but its explicit job would be to, create that ID and insert it.
Yeah, that would go. I mean, that would go against sort of the standard idiom that Spring Data does, which is an implicit upsert, and has the database automatically create the ID. I mean, it does argue in favor in general, which I actually think I prefer of assigning IDs sort of outside the database. But that has other benefits. All right, then let's.
I mean, we could. I think that's a bridge we can cross when we get to it. And I do think it would be. I mean, maybe we're getting to the point where it would be interesting to do the to do the multiple games before we call it quits.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't like implicitness, especially not implicit major side effects in my code. Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't necessarily like it either, but sometimes we do have to deal with frameworks that we may not have chosen, right?
Yeah, but when I'm using a framework that does implicit magic that I think needs to be explicit, then I'll make my wrapper make that behavior explicit. Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, Dota is. I completely agree with Dota. I think in a stateless HTTP environment, the path is load, do, save. Load, save, do, load. Or I mean, it's a very strange ordering to me. And if that's a consequence of using Spring Data, then we need to find that aspect of Spring Data and shoot it in the head.
Well, so this is where I guess I differ with you. I don't fight frameworks as much as you do, because the companies I work with are very embedded with that framework, and doing things like, let's do it this way because the quote design is better, which I don't necessarily disagree with, and using the framework in a non-idiomatic way, I think is a losing proposition, because people will always fall back to idiomatic because that's what they're surrounded by.
That's fair. That's fair. If I work with a lot of companies too that have existing stuff, and I don't. I tell my customers, I tell my clients, your style is my style, or my style is your style. My style is your style is what I say. So whatever code style they use is the style I use. And the same thing goes for design. If they're working with a framework that has a particular way of working, then I will work with that way right up until the point that it gets in the way. Right. But that's not what we're doing here. We're trying to provide an example of how this can be done really well. So let's do it really well.
Okay.
So
So that specific case that was just here was an artifact of a refactoring that's not a big deal.
okay. So how come the
So let's
save
try that.
happens before the role is assigned?
So this is to ensure that I don't assign anything until the thing, I don't notify anybody of anything happening. And if I were really trying to be
Oh,
proper
okay. That's not
transactional-
actually assigning the role. That's doing the notification.
Exactly. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it.
And if I really cared, I'd doing something like the outbox pattern. But this is to make sure I'm not notifying anybody of something that, hey, well, let me look in the database for that, and it wasn't there.
Yeah. Scroll up a little bit.
Mhm.
So execute and save. Right. Just go ahead and I was ranting. So if you could undo and let me see the refactoring you just did here.
That was just an inline. It was an awful in. Hold on a minute. So this is what it was before.
Right. So that's good. Why not just delete line 92? Why?
Because if I do, then it doesn't have access to game that it needs here. This game is a local to the Lambda.
Oh,
That's why I had to inline it.
Got it. Because this, of course, GameService is effectively a global that has no state, so it doesn't have a game.
Right.
Right.
And yes, Luigi mentions I could have execute and save return the game. That would be okay too.
I kind of like that. Let's do that. Because I like this execute and save abstraction that you have.
So let's say return game. Yeah. And then we could do that. Whoops. What happened? And just place that G. There we go.
Okay.
So that violates my definition of a command method.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't normally do that.
I would probably, yeah. I was going to say I'd put the role assigned inside the execute and save, but now you're right. Now we don't have it saved before we do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just revealing some things that I'm hoping to resolve by combining game into GameService. So let's see where this takes us.
Yeah, so the accept is basically accepting consumer. So this is allowing execute and save to allow other methods that are doing modification to execute some command on the game. And sort of it's somewhat reminiscent of the template pattern, where it's like, do this and then do this thing that could possibly change in every scenario, and then do this other standard thing.
I mean, it's just a higher order function, right? This is Java's
exactly.
screwy way of running a function that's passed in.
Exactly. Yeah.
Except is just saying run the function.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So if we go back to line 67 on the left, does it work now?
Let's see.
I wonder if this is all it's been.
Let me just make sure it worked before I change it. Because we just changed the implementation. Okay, so that's fine. This is game. I don't know why it's not suggesting that first. Dot. Wait, no. Okay.
Yeah, that's right, Dota. Yeah, execute and save, all it does is takes a Lambda, loads, runs the Lambda, saves. Is that still not working?
Oh, because the first thing it does is do a load game. So it's the load game, the initial load game, that's the problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we had specified. So it was not actually the reload. It was the initial load that I was expecting to be what we set up here, because when we do the start and then we do the roll dice, that assigns the sixes and then stores the game in the database.
What's this test doing?
So this is checking that, basically checking the notification part of assign current hand to, that we basically are sending out the correct information. So we're saying that if we roll all sixes and we assign it to the category of sixes, the notification gets sent out that this is the roll, the total, and this was the category to which it was assigned.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we're calling...
Yeah, so Suiji, that's right. Basically, every time we do a command method, right, start changes a game, roll dice changes a game, and assign current hand changes a game. Each time it's doing a load, modify, save.
Yeah, which is accurate, because that's what's happening in the actual web app. Is when somebody, every time they interact with the web page,
exactly,
it makes a call to the HTTP service. It wakes up from nothing,
right?
Says, "Oh, I don't know what's going on. Let me ask the database," and does something, and then it saves it, and then it,
right,
forgets everything again.
Yeah, it does. It has very, very much amnesia.
Yeah. Let me look around a little bit. Hopefully my code together session is working here. I have some ideas,
Okay.
which is that let's not try to make this test work, but let's make the test do the thing that it's trying to do. And I think with Nullables, we'll have that ability. So what this is doing is saying, start up, roll the dice. You had to do that because you were persistent. You were actually creating a new game.
Mm-hmm.
But are you seeing my highlights, by the way?
Yeah.
With the Nullables, I think what we can do is just say, GameService, you exist in this state, and here's the command that's coming in. So specifically, I think what we can do, let me just look at GameService. Oops, that's your screen. I can't change that one. GameService.
Yeah, so we could basically do a game database, create null with a null response of what we expect the tracker to see.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking is when we say assign. So basically, what we need to do is create the game service in the state that it is going to be
right
after the dice have been rolled.
Yes.
Which I think we can do.
Yeah, I think we can do that.
It should just be so. The start and the roll dice aren't relevant to this test. They were just set up.
Mm-hmm.
Start's not relevant at all, so we can ignore that. Roll dice, all that's doing is creating a current hand with all the dice being sixes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what we want to do, what does GameDatabase take? I don't recall now.
I think you can do...
And I can't get it to tell me.
The create null takes a configured snapshot.
Okay.
So we can do a new snapshot.
Yeah, go ahead and do it.
Okay.
My system is not super
so we can do new games
helpful.
Snapshot. And that takes a number of rolls that would be... What we want to do is say that that's going to be 1. Round completed is not 0, false. And then the handed dice is those all sixes. So we can basically say, and it's of, and then the scoreboard. I think that can be empty.
Yeah.
So new scoreboard snapshot. We just say empty map. So I think that will work, and then we can comment out the roll dice. And yeah, let's try that. Yep, that works.
Okay.
So we could probably get rid of, because we don't really care about the die roller. What we care about is what the hand of dice in play is.
Right.
So we could probably get rid of that. So let's try that. This would be die roller, create null. Create or create null?
Create null. Shouldn't be relevant, but just as a matter of principle, I use nulled versions in my tests, unless there's a good reason not to.
Yeah, so now we can get rid of that. So notifier, that's our track assignments. You're right, Sweegie. I'm surprised we hadn't created a scoreboard empty factory method yet, or at least snapshot empty.
Well, actually, this actually relates to something else I've been wanting to bring up. Why don't you go ahead and finish this here?
Yeah. Okay. I think that's as much as we need. So we create the notifier. We need that because we're going to track it. I can inline that. That's
no, you can't, because we have line 64. We have to track it, and you can't,
because we actually have to track it. Right.
Yeah.
Then we have the tracker. So pass that in. The rest are create null with the snapshot of all sixes. And yeah. So
the thing that I wanted to bring up, the thing that I see that we're missing here is a pattern I call zero impact instantiation. No, not zero impact, parameterless instantiation, which is that just because it makes life easier, I want every single class in my code to be able to be instantiated with no parameters. And for logic code, that typically means just a constructor that has nothing. For code with eventual infrastructure dependencies, it means making it nullable and having a create null factory. And for value objects, it typically means having a create test instance factory. And the reason is that value objects typically have to be constructed with some data.
Yes.
And if you construct them with no data and put in defaults, then those defaults will be meaningless. So instead of calling that making a constructor with no parameters, I say create test instance, because that's only ever used by tests, and like making it really obvious. If you see this in production code, something's gone wrong somewhere. Either somebody has misunderstood and it's got the wrong name, or more likely it's just shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
So I think what we're missing here, if I may for a moment, I think we're missing a game.snapshot.create test instance. And we've got a little bit of, I'm not sure how to make this pretty in Java, but it'd be new game.snapshot.options or something, with current hand 66666. This is the same pattern we've used elsewhere in our nullables.
Right.
And then that's the way it would be. And knowing the way you like to format it, would probably look like that. And that way, basically, we only specify the thing we care about.
Right. Yeah. This is, like Suiji said, my preference is create test data builders for this.
Yeah, and I'm fine with that. I put it in my production code because it's very tightly coupled to the production code. And so when things are tightly coupled, I like them to live as close together. The more tightly coupled they are, the closer I want them to live in the code. That's one of my one of my design principles. Things that change together live together. So, and I really don't care about test code and production code. Like, I've gotten over that because it makes life easier in so many ways. Anyway, I've made a note of that. I don't think I want to do that change now, but it's something I'm noticing that would make our life easier.
Agreed. I mean, in this case, there are two pieces of information that are important to specify, and there's an implicit third. The fact that it's the first roll maybe isn't terribly relevant, but it can't be 0. And this has to be false, which could be the default, but
just from a logic perspective, it doesn't make sense for it to not be. Sorry, did I talk on top of you? You keep freezing up on me, so I don't know if I'm talking on top of you or not.
The Zoom is a bit laggy. We'll have to fix that during the break. So but certainly we've done this pattern, this enough of an empty scoreboard that I'd create probably on the snapshot an empty or something.
Okay. Well, should we take our break?
Yes, let's do that. So test pass. All right. We'll be back shortly.
Yeah, we had just finished we've just finished getting that test working. It was just a matter of focusing the test further. So let's go ahead and find the next test.
Yeah, I want to spend a minute of talking about what we just did, because I sometimes feel like I'm doing it wrong. And so like this test was driving the service to a point where it made sense for it to notify. And what we basically did was saying, well, we don't need to drive it anymore. We can just say it is in this state.
Yeah.
And it's one of those, I know I don't always pay attention to sort of what am I actually testing?
Right.
And I think sometimes I make my tests more complicated than they need to be, because I'm driving it through the well-encapsulated interface of the things that require you to do certain things that make sense, rather than saying, hey, we're loading up the game every time. Let's just create a game that's in that state, and then do the last command. And so this is for me something I know I need to do a better job of really focusing, like, what are we actually testing here? Do we, yes, it's in the setup part, but can we bypass that? There is, of course, I think the danger of, do you somehow create the state in like maybe
an inaccessible or illegal state? Yeah,
and there we covered that, right? I mean, we wouldn't allow that should be protected elsewhere just to prevent it. So I think I might just be overly.
Well, I think in a way this relates to the mutable versus immutable state conversation we had at the beginning of the show, which is that, to me, and you're not the only one who does this. We all do this. But when I see a test that I have to do a lot of manipulation to get it to the place where I want it to be, do this, which changes state,
right?
Do this that changes state, do this that changes state. To me, that says that's definitely a smell. Like, it's either a problem in my test or it's a problem in my design. Because, and you've mentioned this too, like that working at a distance problem.
Yeah.
If I cannot have my test operate directly on the thing I'm testing, then either my test is wrong or my design is wrong. And sometimes it turns out that, because it's all design is trade-offs, this is the best design we can come up with.
Right.
But yeah, I do think it comes back to, I think part of it is it, when you have immutable state, it becomes much easier to just set things up in the state you want them to be.
Right.
Whereas when you have an object with mutable state, then you're going to encapsulate that state, and you cannot just set it up the way you want it to be, because it doesn't, you're supposed to go through the public methods. And I think, I hadn't thought of it this way, but I think that's part of the reason I prefer immutable state, because it's just easier to get things into the state I want it to, because all the state is accessible, can be specified, if that makes sense.
Yeah, what's interesting, and Suiji, that's right. It's like it feels very much related to the persistence problem of, you don't want to drive the object through its sort of public API to restore its state from persistence. And so I think it's the same thing. Once you have the snapshot, it's really useful, not just for persistence, but we're literally using that here to get it into a valid starting state. And so even though it's not necessarily mutable, just the snapshot idea, and the snapshot is, I guess you could think about as being an immutable.
I think it is. Well, I guess it's not technically, but
it's not I mean, it itself is an immutable object, but that's not sort of, it's not about immutability. But that idea of saying, how quickly, how easily can I drive the object to the state I want to test? And this is why end-to-end tests are so difficult, because you're trying to drive this inner state into something from a great distance, right? From cross country, as it were.
You're actually you're modifying state that's kind of hidden to somebody reading
exactly.
And there was a little bit of that happening in this test too. That we were driving the state in a way that was a bit hidden. So I like this test better. It is much more direct. I think there's a lot of noise in it still in terms of lines basically 69, 70, 71. Well, not 71, but 69 and 70 aren't really super relevant here.
Right.
And this is where my where what I call signature shielding, but basically helper methods come in. But again, we haven't been doing a lot of that because it's so much more painful to do that in Java than it is in languages that have optional parameters.
Yeah, I mean, it's not hard, but we haven't focused that much on it. But yes, this would be something that I would probably pull into if a factory method that's shared. Maybe a builder, but certainly some factory methods to do that. Yeah. And I think it points to, and I know I don't refactor my test code as much as I look back and say, oh, why didn't I refactor that better? And it's just and I always say, like, to folks, like, refactor your test code as well. And it's not, I think when I'm sort of in the midst of doing it, I don't often, or as often as I'd like to, come back and say, okay, now let me look at this and what's noisy. Sometimes I'll pick the low hanging fruit, but really taking a step back and say, what are you trying to test? Which is what I started out with. It's like, what are you actually trying to test here? And really focus on that, I think, is something that it's worth that second look.
I think the thing for me that really forced me to start being aggressive about factoring out helper methods, well, there were two things. One, I stopped using setup methods.
I don't use those either. Yeah.
Because those cause all kinds
those
of
are
problems.
hidden evil.
Yeah. Those are landmines laying in wait. But then the other thing was, in JavaScript, it's so painful to refactor that I started getting really aggressive about pulling those things out as soon as I needed them.
Right.
Because if I didn't, then it was painful later on.
Right.
And so that was a little bit of a training for me. Now my default is to pull them out pretty much right away. Maybe the second test I'm writing.
It could be that's why I also delay, because it's so easy in Java to refactor. It's like, that's easy. I'll wait till later.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and finish migrating the...
Yes, I think there was one other place that was... So I think we caught this one. Yep, that one's right. I guess I could have looked for the delete me references. That might be easier.
Yeah, that should do it.
So there's this one. Well, that's the GameService, which I guess we'll have to fix.
Right, but we'll
fix that
do
in a
that
second.
last.
Yeah. So this is the last test one that's doing it. So
that should probably be okay. Well, again, maybe not. Create GameService with die roles of. That actually may need to be a current hand of.
Yeah, let's.
Oh no, this is the die roller.
This is the die roller, so this should be okay. So let's do new. No. Game database.
Yeah, Astrid, I'm with you. I will typically. One thing that Ted and I do differently is I will typically only have one test file per class, whereas Ted breaks them up according to the different types of tests. And so because I only have one test file, it makes sense to put the builder in the test file that uses it. And if I need the same builder in multiple test files, I kind of wonder what I'm doing wrong. But that's where I'll introduce, I don't know if you were here earlier, but that's where I introduced like a factory method on the production code to help me as a helper.
The way I tend to go is I'll create a helper method in the test, and in the test class, and if I start using it across multiple tests, I'll elevate it to a top level class, because I'm fine with more files than you are.
Yeah.
And then as it gets more in need of configuration, then I'll, and there are lots of different factory methods, then I'll promote it to sort of a builder level of complexity.
Yeah. The funny thing is I used to feel like a file that was longer than 100 lines was a problem. And for whatever reason, I don't feel that way anymore. And maybe I've just gotten lazy. But these days, I care more about having fewer files, which makes it easier for me to find what I'm looking for in a large project than having small files. They still need to be well designed. And if production code's more than 100 lines, I start to raise my eyebrows.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't feel the same way about tests. The tests will just go on and on. But a big part of that is, again, having the ability to break the tests up into conceptual blocks.
Yeah.
Makes a difference.
Yeah.
So are we done? Are all of our tests
so this test is failing, but I think we could do a similar thing here. This is saying...
Oh, so yeah, it's doing the same sort of setup.
So we could do the same thing here. Get it to, because it's really the reroll that we care about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we should inline that create game service with die rolls of.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah. No, I think we should, because we've only got the two tests.
Yeah,
and
there are only two
different things out of it.
Yeah, so let's do that.
Yeah, Astrid, that would definitely be where I draw the line.
Oh God. my policy is if I have to scroll to read a method, it is too long.
Yeah.
I
still keep my methods real short.
That's my policy. So that's fine. So
I think what we're going to want to do is create the die roller of 2 and 3 with 2 and 3 in it.
Yes.
And create the database
right
with the snapshot of the other things.
Yeah, we just did that. So let's go.
So again, this is where that parameterless instantiation would come in handy. Either as a create test instance factory on the game snapshot, which is how I do it, or as the test builder, which is how you do it. It's really the same end result, just a matter of what design you think is better.
Oh, I forgot to take out the things that we don't need anymore.
But we put some work into that exception, and that was a nice little exception message, wasn't it?
Let's see. So
current hand is probably loading back out of the database.
Current hand is definitely loading out of the database.
So what is reroll doing for us?
Reroll is basically saying keep these. So we rolled all six.
No, I know that, but is it saving the game? Is it returning the game?
It is loading and returning the hand of the game. So it does a load.
Okay. No, not current hand. Reroll. What is reroll?
I'm sorry. Reroll is just doing execute and save.
Can we have it return the game?
We could, but that's not what the controller needs from it.
Yeah, we're going to be refactoring all this anyway. Because the issue is right now, the assertion is testing current hand, and current hand is just looking at the state of the database. We've lost the state that happened, the state change that happens in line 49.
Right. My reluctance is okay, we'll just do it.
What was your reluctance?
Well, my reluctance is the same thing I had before, is the UI doesn't need it. And so we're returning it purely to work around what is, in my opinion, a problem with nullables in these particular scenarios, that it's not a fake.
No, it's true. I think if we want our design to work this way, nullables are inappropriate. But I've been saying all along I have a problem with design, so it's not because of nullables.
Well, but I mean, it's so what I'm trying to figure out is where does nullables fit? Because we could have game database create fake that basically gives you turns on a fake that does things.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, I actually my nullable clock that I use is actually a fake, not a stub.
Right.
So yeah, there's nothing about nullables that says you have to use a stub. You could use a fake in the underlying implementation. It's more complicated to do that, and not necessary most of the time.
All right, so let's do this.
Suiji says, could we change the test to check for a particular save game via output tracking? Yeah, we could, Suiji. But I don't want to. But that's actually how you would resolve this issue, Ted, is because the side effect of reroll is the saved game. Like really what it's doing is saving the game. Checking the current hand isn't checking reroll, it's checking current hand. And so if we wanted to be pure about it, we would check to see
we would check to see what was saved. Right.
But I think that this behavior that we have of these methods all doing load and save, I think that's wrong. So I don't want to, I think if we encode that into our tests, we're going to make our lives difficult later when we refactor it.
So let's go and do that. And then it's game.
Endofunctor, assuming I understand the situation, which sounds like there's some context there that I may not be getting, but if it's a process engine, that would probably be what I would consider logic layer code, and I wouldn't use nullables at all in that. The engine would be tested via normal unit tests, and it would just be, and maybe the engine would return commands that interfaced with the outside world, and those would be what I would test with the nullables.
Okay, so that worked.
Astrid, nullables are an alternative to spies. We have actually spent the last 15 episodes moving away from spies, so that's the other way. That would be going the wrong way for us. We certainly could do that, but we don't want to. So we've got everything done now?
Yeah. So I think Astrid, the spy in this case, we could use the output tracker, which is what Suiji suggested. That would be similar in concept, at least in terms of what we could assert against. So, all right. So now the only other usages of this are in the game service itself. So all of our tests, let me run all the tests. Those are all working. So let's go replace this with game database create null.
That should be create.
This should be create. Create.
Except we don't have a create. This has thrown us every time.
This is the one with the constructor.
Yeah. And it's going to take a JPA.
And that's... so who's calling this create? It's calling it from the config. So we can totally have that passed in. So let's do that. And then what used to call this. Have that auto wired. Let's see, does that compile? Yes. Let's run the tests. All right, so that worked.
Okay.
And there was one more. This is the create null. So this is just game database, create null.
Okay.
You need anything in the null responses?
Nope. We don't need to remember
there's the game
nullables.
database, which is interesting.
What'd you say?
So the part of the null responses is a game database. So do we use create null, or do we grab it from the null responses?
No, we just use the default.
Okay.
I mean, that gets back to the parameterless instantiation, is that they all have the ability to be constructed with nothing, and they just provide some reasonable defaults in that case.
But if somebody specified null as part of null responses, they wanted to specify a game database, we'd be ignoring that.
Oh no, you're right. We do pass in the.
Yeah.
My head was in the wrong spot.
All right.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. This is null responses.gamedatabase.
Yeah. Okay. Tests.
Suiji, I think that's a Spring thing, not a Nullables thing, because only the Nullable version doesn't know about the JPA. Only the non-nulled version does. What has just happened here?
We probably did not always specify. Did we specify a default for this? We did. Doesn't like it.
So it may be that.
It may be that these tests are also assuming a fake.
Yeah, that's what's happening.
Because like this one is certainly.
Okay, so let's put that back and then find our usages of create null, and maybe I can make a note. It's the view tests, and what else?
It's one view test. So it's actually. I think it's all view tests. Well, it's basically anything that's going through that's testing against the controllers.
Yeah.
Because
it's the same thing again. They're doing multiple actions. They shouldn't be, though. The test of the controller should be a single action. But there's probably some state setup happening that's in those tests.
Well, so for example, here it's basically doing a post. So it's using sort of testing at a distance to get it to the point where there are too many roles.
Right.
And we could again replace that with a better startup.
That's in fact exactly what we'll have to do.
Yeah, we'll have to do that.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and put line 57 back.
Yeah. That's not right. That's too far back. That's what we want.
Yeah, Suiji, I'm still not getting what it is that you're talking about. We don't need the game services. So the JPA was always being injected by Spring, which means that the game service always was passing it through, but
it wasn't passing it it wasn't passing it in directly to the service. So this, I mean, obviously we're no longer abiding by hexagonal architecture, but this violates hexagonal architecture because we're passing in a framework-specific infrastructure reference directly into the application layer of game service.
Right, but that again is just because of the way we've chosen to do it. If we had it doing the magic dependency injection, then we could just do that, right? Like game database is still a global. and it could be we could have Spring inject the game database JPA.
No, because Spring can inject into non-Spring managed things. So Spring really should have no idea that GameService. Again, this is the hexagonal point of view, is it has no direct dependencies on the framework. And so once we have a reference to something that is framework, then now you can't run GameService.
Why do we have a reference to game database now? We've always had a reference to.
Well, no, before we had an interface that was a port, but now we're directly talking to. So this is an artifact of game database, but it's one of those you pull on a thread and it drags a whole bunch of things with it. So here we need to, because GameService has to be created as part of the startup.
So let me back up.
Okay.
GameService always had a reference to a game repository, correct?
It always had to a
like after you added the database, it had a reference to a game repository.
Yes, but not the Spring database repository.
Right. Well, it had game repository, which was an interface, which at runtime was an actual Spring database.
At runtime in production, yes.
And so that game repository was injected into GameService.
Correct.
By what?
By this method here.
GameService.
This create GameService method in the config.
Right. So if we wanted to emulate that, we could. We could have, before line 11, we could create our game database there and inject the game database into the GameService, which is exactly the way the existing code, the previous code works.
Right.
There's nothing about the nullables.
Right.
It's just the way that we're interfacing with Spring that's making this happen.
Then let's do that. Because that was bugging me. So now we can do that. And now that's better. That should still work.
Yeah. Now, A-frame, the not A-frame architecture, but the testing without mocks patterns show you how to solve this problem when you don't have a dependency injection framework.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, you would say game database.create, and game database would be responsible for going out and getting the connection.
Right.
And maybe you pass in the configuration that has the connection string and so forth.
Right.
But because we're using a dependency injection framework, we have to work within its constraints.
Right. I'm going to do a
and what we had before was sort of halfway between the two.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So let's see.
So we've modified the GameService tests to use the nulled game database rather than the in-memory game database.
All right. All right.
Okay. So now we should be able to go through our... It's interesting that the view controller has this issue, but the... or was it the case in all of our controllers?
It was pretty much most of them that were relying on some kind of built-up state.
Right.
And yeah, this test right here, this is could consider this sort of not quite, I mean, not end to end, but certainly more of a scenario, a larger scenario mm-hmm. than just the specifically getting it again, the same kind of thing. Get it into the state where if I do another roll, it shouldn't be allowed. versus
and I think if you wanted to have that sort of end-to-end test, you could make the database nullable use a fake rather than a stub.
Right.
But in the interests of exploring the limitations of the embedded stubs, I'd like to keep it as the embedded stub and see what happens. I think we could solve this really easily by giving it a little bit of state and just having it.
Yeah, I mean,
but I'd rather not.
Yeah, and I agree that yes, we could just throw fake and it would work. But again, sort of looking back at that question of what are we actually trying to test here?
Mm-hmm.
Are we testing that we can roll the dice and re-roll, or are we just testing that if it is in this state and we try to re-roll, that it's a bad? And in fact, like the test is really not saying, I don't care how you got there. It's the last thing that triggers it that this is the only thing we're asserting on. All the rest is set up. And so I agree, like, yes, we could use a fake, but here maybe we really shouldn't.
So I want to take a moment. Coach Githers just crapped the bed again. Okay, well, I'll have you do it then.
Okay.
Could you bring up GameDatabase.createNull? I don't remember what our interface was on that. And I'm just wondering, I think before we start making these changes, we're going to want to make it easier to manipulate the game database. So we have create null with a specific snapshot.
Yep.
We have create empty null. We have create corrupted null. So I think what we need is we need the ability to say create null with only the piece of the snapshot that we care about. Like on line 77 on the left, really what we need to be able to do is say create a database where the current roll is 3.
Right.
Or whatever. The current throw is 3.
Yes,
so exactly as true.
Yeah. So it's basically the as default with this change.
Yeah. And we could do that with the parameterless instantiation / test factory on game snapshot, or we could do it on game database. And I'm not sure which one I prefer more. I am observing that we're always wanting it in the context of the game database.
Yeah, we're always wanting in the context of a game database because games are loaded from the database, and so that's where we want it from. Yeah.
The thing is that that's somewhat a consequence. Okay, now here's a thought. And again, I think this is because we're in a little bit of an in-between station in our design. The create null interface to a class is not supposed to be about the implementation of that class. It's supposed to be about what do its callers care about. So if you go back to GameService, yeah, this is sort of what I'm getting at, Suiji, is I want to be more domainy in our game service. Right now we have create null that gives us. So ultimately our controller is going to be calling GameService.create null. We don't have a way of providing the game database. We can provide it in create, but that's not what we're doing.
Wait. Well, eventually we'd be able to do it here because this last one is the database. Unless I'm not understanding what you just said. Oh,
no, you're right. Nulled responses is dot. I've forgotten. Can you go down to nulled responses?
Yeah, there is a .game database in it.
There's a .game database.
Yeah, right there.
Yeah, but I'm wondering if that's actually a mistake. What if, so go back down to that.
I can bring both up.
Okay, yeah. So nulled responses, we have the die rolls. We have the score responses, the average score responses. We've got the game database. What if we say that we want to be able to create the game service with a particular game? This is sort of getting at what Suiji was talking about. Because again, the nulled interface isn't about the internal implementation. Yeah, it's pulling it out of the game database, but it's more about, well, how does it want to be used by callers?
Right.
The game service.
The test doesn't care that it came from a database or a simulated database or a nullable database. It just cares that when I say, give me the current hand, it gives me the one I gave it to it.
That's right. In a in a particular game state.
Yes.
So what if, and this is why, remember how before I kept saying, oh, we don't want the game service test to use the null interface. We want them to use the constructor. This sort of gets back to that because the users of game service are different than the tests of game service. So what I'm thinking is that we should change the nulled responses to be not the game database, but the game. We can get a snapshot out of the game, right?
Well, yeah, of course we can get a snapshot of the game. Yeah. I'm just thinking about if there are some tests that do care about these pieces, the notifier, the fetcher, that are these three pieces are the game service has sort of direct access to. They're the collaborators, whereas the game it happens to get them through yet another collaborator.
But I'm not suggesting we change that. Nulled responses allows us to set the average score responses.
So have null responses have a way to specify a game.
Yeah, instead of specifying a game database.
I got it. Sorry, I thought you were just saying change create null. Okay, that makes sense. Because like when do we specify the game database? It's because we want a game of a certain type.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
And now Sweegie does raise the good point, which is that some tests work with a corrupted game. But I think, again, we'd put that on the nulled responses. We'd say, we already have it with corrupted game.
Right. And so with game would hide the creation of the nulled game database.
Yeah.
That has a snapshot of that game. Yeah.
No, this is good. This is exactly the right behavior.
Yeah.
This is the exact right spot for it.
So let's go here.
Now, can we create a game in the state that we want, like without having to poke at it?
We cannot create a game at any so here, if we just accepted a game, we'd still have to drive it.
So maybe what we want to do then is say with game snapshot.
Yeah, it sort of depends on what do we want the callers to do. Do we want the callers to just say, here's the state and let's drive it from here? Or do we want them to drive to that state? And I think probably the former.
Based on everything we've been saying, we want it to start in the state we want.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, Suiji, I think we might revisit this decision later, as we continue to refactor games. I think there are some issues here between the responsibilities of game service, game, and game snapshot that may end up changing as we continue to look at it and refactor.
So sorry, go ahead, finish up.
Oh, I was just going to say, but for right now, I think the game snapshot makes a lot of sense. But you were about to say something. Yeah,
no, what I was going to say is basically, if game changed the way it was persisted, but the way you drive it is the same, you would end up having to change everywhere you create a snapshot.
Well, yeah, and that's sort of what I meant in that there's that's why I included the game snapshot as like one of these three things.
Yes,
because you're right. I don't want to change the controller tests if we change the snapshot.
Right.
I don't know. I think it's an interesting kind of talking to me.
It's funny though. It's an interesting trade-off. Like, I could go either way, but then sort of thinking about that last piece, like, because if some of the role stuff got pulled out and then pushed out, and then maybe I could imagine refactors that would change the structure of the snapshot that would not change the interface of game.
If it was me, probably what I do, and I think this might, trigger your gag reflex, but if it was me, I think what I would do is, just treating it in a vacuum, I'd probably have game be immutable and constructible in exactly the state we wanted it to be.
Well, what's funny is, like, in a sense, that's what we do with a snapshot.
Yeah.
Right,
Well,
'cause
that's
the-
why.
the
That's again. That
snapshot-
sort of gets back to
yeah, yeah.
you know, does game snapshot really need to exist? You know,
Well, I mean, if
Yeah.
you were to pass in the state directly, then you're basically passing all the individual little pieces that might get just awkward, and then you'd probably group it up into an object, which would end up being your snapshot.
yes. Let's go ahead. So I think the thing that we could do, without changing too much, is we could make game more directly drivable. In that, well, no. Let's do it the way Suiji said. Let's
Suiji, thank you. It's like, yes, let's argue. Let's put it in the code.
let's do sort of the least impactful thing, which is pass the game into the game service and drive the state of the game in the test.
Mm-hmm. So let's do that.
And I do still see that driving the state of the game as being a bit of a smell, but I think doing anything else is a much bigger change. And you're right. I don't want to have the controller be aware of the snapshot. That feels like it's outside of its encapsulation responsibilities.
So let's see. So we want to, oops. So we want to pass in a game. Okay. So let's.
So what are you doing here?
I'm thinking of doing a refactoring, but that might be more than.
This isn't the right place to do that.
Well, I was going to basically extract this and then push it over to this code.
I think we just need to add a with game to our.
Yeah, I was going to do that through
node responses.
Yeah, I was just going to do that through refactoring, but I don't have to. So let's go public no responses with game. So then it's basically game database equals game database game dot. Okay, I got to rename that. Remind me to rename that.
Yeah, go ahead and rename it now.
Let's go. Yeah, all right, let's go do that. Because that's really annoying. Okay. Put this back. And snapshot. Return this. Yeah, I could have done with the refactoring, but that would have actually taken.
I'm not sure if you could have, because that code does not actually use the nulled responses. Like, you could have done it, but I don't know if it would have been.
Yeah, it probably would have taken longer. So now we can basically say.
I've got a style request.
Yeah.
Can you put with game before with corrupted game?
Sure. My one worry, and I'm curious what you think, is do you think people might unintentionally, like, these are mutually exclusive? Would you put in any exception throwing saying, hey, you already specified the game database? Or
No.
Or would you just say that that's just not going to happen?
Line 141 needs fixing too. It's true for all of them. If you call with die rolls twice, the
Sure.
second one overrides.
Sure.
I'm just not super concerned about it.
Yeah. I was just curious. Okay.
Partly because I know this is probably not going to be used by anything that's not thoroughly tested. So
That's true. It's pretty much using the context test.
no, we don't want to modify that test.
Yeah, this one I don't want to modify. Because because we don't want to drive this one actually. So let's go to the one that we do. So now, so this is using create game service.
Oh,
This might be a problem. It might be too late because everything's already wired up by the time this test starts.
does it need to be wired up? Is there a reason we can't just create? Oh, because the game service has to be passed into the web page.
Yeah.
This is a good point to take a break.
All right. Kick the can down the road a little.
Yeah.
All right, we'll take a break.
3 minutes worth.
Yeah, and we'll be back and see if we have any answers.
Yeah. Put your answers in the chat. If there's no answers in the chat, then it's not our fault.
And Suiji had a question from earlier or a suggestion from earlier that we could also talk about.
Which one is that?
I'll repaste it, or Suiji can repaste it.
All right,
we'll be back, and we're back.
All right. So, any strokes of insight on the throne, wherever you were?
No, I don't think.
Show me the controller again.
Yeah. I don't think we can figure it out from here.
So yeah, we can't just create. Scroll up all the way up to the top.
Oh, sorry.
So what's stopping us from just creating just? I hate it when people say just. What's stopping us from instantiating the view controller with our game service and then calling the methods we want to call?
So this is exactly the situation that we didn't dive into last time, which is Spring, and I actually just mentioned it in chat. So in a sense, this is testing, at least this specific test is testing that somewhere an exception got thrown and got translated into a bad request. And that can only be done, and that's done explicitly by the framework, and that's done by this exception handler. So it sees too many roles exception being thrown, and translates that into a bad request response.
Got it.
Now,
all right.
So what's interesting though is if that's really what I'm testing, I could care less about like the game database or the game at all. What I need is a game service that throws too many roles exception.
Mm-hmm. But we still need to inject a game service that is set up that way.
Right. But then we can do that here. So if there was create null throws too many and we pass an exception to always throw or whatever we would configure it, then that would be sufficient. But then we'd have to split out the test method into only use this configuration.
So would we have multiple test files then with different configurations?
Yes.
Okay. So it's basically back to the bad old days of having to have a setup. So we need one test file per setup.
Correct.
Yeah. So in that case,
and this is where some people might say, well, why don't you just use the mock bean and then you can tell Makito to just say when you call this, throw the exception.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm not sure I have a good argument against that.
Well, it's just that now you're not testing the real thing. I mean, if what you're doing is testing that the exception happened, I mean, if what you're doing is testing that line 70 exists, yeah. But so if we have the ability to execute an arbitrary line 29 on the left, then we don't need a game service .create throw exception, although maybe we want to. We can still create the game, do all the stuff.
Sure.
And then do the thing.
Right. Right. So we could still create a game that is in the state that
we'll throw an exception.
But that's still custom per that specific test method, because these other ones expect the things to be in a different state.
Yeah. And that's exactly the problem with setup methods.
Well, yeah, I mean that's why I try to minimize the amount of testing I do at this level, because it's very annoying. But if I am testing this wiring here that I've properly defined an exception handler
that does nothing.
Well, it basically causes Spring to return a bad request status.
Ah, I see. Right.
Yeah. So this is again sort of the magic of IntelliJ, not the magic. The magic of Spring's what is it? AOP stuff.
Yeah. Hey, I just saw, apropos of nothing, I just saw that there is a proposal out for decorators, like annotations, in JavaScript. And I saw that. I said, oh, God, no, please, no. And then I read it. And so my understanding is that in Java and in C#, the annotations are just metadata that you can only access through a reflection. And then what that metadata happens to it is, according to whoever's reading the metadata and tries to do something with it.
Right.
So decorators in JavaScript are totally different. They are syntactic sugar for calling a function whose name is the decorator and passing it the function that the decorator is on. It's actually just syntactic sugar for high-level function calls. And that's really cool, because now it's not spooky action at a distance. You actually have a function you're calling that you can trace into and see what it does. Anyway, I thought that was cool. It was the first time because I've never seen a decorator I liked.
Yeah, I'm glad they didn't try to recreate what's basically kind of broken.
What's basically what?
Kind of broken in Java in the way that the annotations and
yeah, I mean it's really powerful.
C# didn't. I don't know. I think they made it worse, but
I don't know how it works under the covers in C#, but I think it's basically the same thing. It's still metadata.
Yeah, I believe so. I haven't looked at. Maybe they've been adding stuff, so who knows? Maybe they added stuff that Java doesn't have.
Yeah, I cannot keep track of it all. Annotations are really useful, but they're very magical.
Well, the ones that are magical.
Right. Yeah.
if they're not magical, then yeah, like Wheatlall says, it's like annotations are annotations, and to try to use them as decorators or other stuff is just
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the syntax is the same, and they fulfill the same purpose. But you're right, and this is where I heard about it, Suiji, is TypeScript introduced decorators, but they did that because it's being added to the JavaScript spec. It's just not as far along for the JavaScript as it is with TypeScript. Anyway, so for an annotation-like thing, I thought that was neat.
That doesn't help us here, though.
No, it doesn't. No, that was me kicking the can further down the road. We got 40 minutes to kill, right? So, so is there no way to annotate a method to say, run this setup function? Or does it have to be at the class level?
Well, I mean, what's happening is this because this is tagged with WebMVC test. It's doing some things around configuration that happen before it runs anything in the test. And so by the this configuration has already run before it even tries to run any of the test methods. And there's just that's the way it's designed.
And there's no way to configure the configuration.
There is no way to, well, I mean, you can, but the reason why it probably doesn't get much attention is because 99.99% of the people will just say, oh, let me make whatever it is you're trying to do, use mockbean, and then use Mockito's way to substitute whatever gets returned. There is a way to go into the container itself and basically push in to replace at runtime what's happening sort of at startup time.
Okay, so what does mock bean do? Like, if mock bean can return an arbitrary thing, can we make it return the thing we want it to return?
Well, so we could say mock bean and then say GameService. And so what'll happen is the mock bean will wrap the object in a proxy, or it'll basically create an empty proxy because it's just mocking it out and not providing anything.
But it doesn't give us any handle.
But it doesn't give you a handle. There may be another way, but again, it's one of those, nobody does that, so that's why it's probably not straightforward. You can AutoWire or either get basically the web application context. This thing, which is the thing that holds references to all the objects that Spring created as part of its dependency injection. And then you could access that and basically find the one that it initially created and basically throw it away and create your own. Whether we want to do that is a separate question.
Yeah, I mean,
so I think we can. Let me try it.
We need to be able to. How many of these tests are testing Spring rather than testing your code? Like, how many of them are we not able to instantiate the controller and run the controller?
So these, so there are what, half a dozen in here.
So I noticed that they're expecting, so go back to the test real quick.
Yeah.
So let's just go through these. Line 48 says it starts the game. It expects it to be successful. That's something that requires the framework.
Mm-hmm.
But is not super interesting because that's just an annotation
right,
that isn't even provided. So that's the default. So, and we're expecting the $.roll to be an array. So that's saying that the template has been wired up.
Yeah, even that I would probably just throw away as well, because I can test that. I can test that directly to see using non-Spring test.
Yeah, I guess what I'm looking for is what are these tests actually testing?
Most of them are testing, does this endpoint exist?
That's not super useful.
Well, it's useful from I want to make sure I've written my annotations correctly.
Yeah.
Like, did I write this as a post and does it respond to this endpoint? And it does basically nothing else in terms of what it's really testing. And again, here I don't have to test that these exist because I can test those directly against the controller. Yeah. So what that looks like is there is these tests that are not Spring tests.
Okay. So really the only Spring test that's problematic is that one, right?
Yeah, so the one that's problematic is indeed really this one. Because
So I see what you were getting at. You say, well, yeah, let's just use a mock, have it throw an exception and call it good.
Yeah.
I do prefer sociable tests. What I think I would do here, if this is the only one that's not working, I would just split this out into another file, use a different configuration, and
yeah, that was my initial thought.
Yeah. No, I was confused because I thought we were going to have to do that, make a separate file for every single test. And that seemed like a problem.
Right. Yeah, in this case, I don't think that's the case. For the yacht controller one, yeah, that one's I haven't written yet. I think so. There's it's only two of these. There's that one and there's this one. This one's just 2xx redirection, redirection, and 200. That might be the only test. Like, I mean, but it's it's one of those where if there were more places where there was some exception handling, then you might have to have more tests, and then there might be a reason to start futzing around with the inversion of the dependency injection container directly.
Yeah, and then I think at that point there would be a judgment call to make, which is how painful is it to make Spring do what we want versus how painful is it to have a mock that throws the exceptions we want. Because I'm stubborn, would probably figure out how to make Spring do what I want and keep sociable tests. But that's because I'm stubborn, and also because once you figure it out, it takes several hours to figure it out. But then once you figure it out,
exactly.
But it's certainly not interesting to do on stream.
Yeah. But I'm gonna play with that offline, because it's always frustrated me that yes, using the mock bean, and so you was surprised at this mock bean. Yes, but I'm not configuring the mock bean, so it was just to get this stuff to work. Because if it's not terrible, like if I had to write 40 lines of code and in order to get, then I might just give up and say, all right, this is the one place I'll use the mock bean, because otherwise it's just too much work. But I'm going to figure that out because I hate it's one of those, like, you start using it and it's like, oh, this is so easy, let me use it everywhere, and then all is lost.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and split. Well, let's just do that one last. Let's solve all of our other problems, which I think will be more interesting. And with any luck, we'll run out of time, and then you can and you can figure it out.
That's called running out the clock.
Yes,
I think I mentioned
that earlier.
I think you get a penalty for that. So let's see. So let's go here. So let me disable this, because I still think there's
I think we had a bunch of other tests that were failing.
Yeah. So and I'm gonna pull this out, because I can test this separately.
So maybe I'm confused, but I thought we had a whole bunch of tests that were failing.
We did, and that's why I want to get to is why were they failing? So let's go run these.
Yeah, and this view controller web, it was just the last test, I believe. And that mock MVC, you added that too. You can take that back out.
Oops. No, I added this. Let me take this back out.
Oh, you're right. You're
right. So this is the only one that fails because it has state. Let me just rerun it just to be sure. Oh, wait, now it passes? How's that possible? Because we didn't replace it. Right. This all happened because in our game service, when we took that back out. Yeah, we took that out. Okay. So let me put that back in. So now,
so it was view controller test.
Yeah, okay, so this is definitely failing for that reason. So we'll come back to that. So let me go and run then. This one shouldn't be a problem. If it is, then
I think these are failing for legitimate reasons.
Yeah, these. Yeah. But let me check out the other. Check out this one. Okay, so that's fine. So then let me. Okay, so
So it's yacht controller, splat, and view controller, all of which we can just fix. Because neither of those are MBC tests.
Right. So this one, so let's focus on this one. So these are all failing. So let's see. So we expect.
Wait a second. That's not testing the controller at all.
So it's testing a side effect that if you that the game basically that the game hasn't been started yet. Whether this is valid or not, that's what it's trying to do.
I mean, it's not valid because we're creating a game service. It's not a valid test of view controller. We're creating a game service. We're passing it into the view controller, which hopefully has no side effects. And then we're calling something on game service. What does view controller constructor do?
So this is ensuring that when when view controller is created, that it does not start a game. But I could be convinced that that's a useless test.
Yeah, I mean, I have a general. I think it's a bad idea for controllers to have side effects. So
this is in a sense ensuring it doesn't have a side effect, which maybe is
I think you can get rid of that test.
I could be convinced to get rid of it. For yes, view controller, there is a view front end for this yacht game. So that's what this is handling. Okay,
so this creates the game service. It wires it up. It starts the game. Now that's actually doing something interesting. And that's failing right now?
That is failing.
Because game service...
Because the create null was assuming...
No, it's failing because round completed is loading the game out of the database.
Right.
With this one and all of these controller tests, we have to use the output tracker.
Okay.
Yeah. So we could add an output tracker to game service that says game saved. That would give us the game that had been saved. We do that against the game service, not the game database.
Right.
Game service is entirely stateless.
Mm-hmm.
It's just going to be a lot of work for something that I think is something I'd rather get rid of anyway. Show me view controller again.
Yep.
So start game is going to just turn around and call game service.start.
Right. So what this test is testing is did this code get wired up? Basically, did the controller call the correct application code?
Right. Yeah. And that makes sense. There's no redirect after that?
No, because this is a RESTful API, so it's just handling a post.
Right. This is the view controller, not the yacht controller.
Yeah. Now, it doesn't mean it can't return anything. It just can return a status code, but I don't think that helps us here. Yeah, I mean, this is where if somebody was using a full Spring test with basically, but created a mock, what they would do, and this is typical against the 90% of the code that I see, they would write a mock for the game service, and then verify that the start method got called.
Now, start game can return anything we want, right? It doesn't have to be a void.
Whatever it returns needs to be serializable, or
Oh, so what it returns gets sent back to
yes.
the...
Right.
Okay, so we can't return something to help us out.
Right.
So I think in this case, we want to do output tracking. We want to say that start game saves a game, and then that game has been started.
Right.
So, yeah, where are we at in terms of checking things in?
We did a check-in recently.
Okay, so let's set this aside. Let's stash this code, and let's modify GameService to support output tracking. I always do this from the command line. There it is.
Oops. Okay. And tests. All right. Yep. Okay. So we wanted to create an output tracker here.
Yeah, and we'll need to test drive that.
Yep. So let's go. All right.
Do we not already have a GameService test?
We do not. We must
have one.
We have one specific.
Oh, I see. We've got them different categories.
Yeah, we've got controller tests.
We've got the average fetcher. We've got the die roller.
Yeah, so we have ones that are checking these three things.
Yeah. So let's make it. Let's call it. So you're just thinking this is going to be a generic. This can be sort of a
because it's sort of because this is just. I mean, we could name it more specifically, but I think it's sort of a more general.
Okay, sure.
Thing.
I mean, the other thing is GameService tracking test, but there's going to be like 2 tests in here, and that'll be it. So, yeah, let's keep it generic and see what happens in the future.
Yeah.
So we just need to test that. Actually, let me look at this code. Okay. You with me?
Yep.
Okay, so output tracking tracks things that we do that affect the outside world in this case, but it does it at the level of abstraction that our callers care about, which in this case is the game. So what we're going to do is basically say anything that we do that saves the game is going to trigger the tracker with the game that we've just saved. So, but we're going to need to check that start saves the game, that roll dice saves the game, that reroll saves the game. And that's it.
And assign.
Does assign
current hand to also saves.
Oh yeah. Yeah, assign. And I think that is it. So that's not so bad. Yeah, so let's just make a test for that. And maybe we should call this GameService tracking test or tracker or something like that.
Yeah, I'm actually going to move this method up. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's basically these 4 commands. Yeah, then we can get rid of game.
Sorry, what was that?
I said then we can get rid of reroll returning a game, I think.
Yeah, we probably could.
Yeah.
That would make you happy, wouldn't it?
That would make me happy, yes.
All right. Let's put that on the list then.
Yeah.
Pellet, I'm not, but describe blocks actually come from BDD, and you see them in all kinds of BDD frameworks. And I'm not a big fan of BDD as a rename of TDD, but I do think the describe blocks and the uses of strings to name tests is a big step forward in terms of usability for testing.
Yeah, I don't know that I honestly haven't looked at, I think I looked at nested tests a couple of times in JUnit 5 and found it, just because of the way Java works, to be awkward, but maybe that's changed. So
we talked about this in one of our earliest
Yes,
episodes, and I remember
yes.
you telling me that it was pretty awkward.
Yeah, but it'd be interesting to compare and contrast, just to see concretely what it looks like, because it's just the memory I have of first trying it out was like, ugh, I don't think this is worth it. But it could just be I'm old and stuck in my ways.
Yeah, aren't we all? Okay, so let's call this start saves the game.
Start saves. Well, saves new game. I don't know how important it is to say that.
I don't know so we're not testing that start saves the game, although maybe we should, because we don't have any tests of that behavior right now, do we?
Not directly, no.
But what we're testing here is specifically the tracker. Like testing that start saves the game, what we would do there is we would actually track the game repository, or the game database actually should probably a better name for it, and assert that the snapshot was saved. But that's not what we're doing in this test. What we're doing in this test is saying that our tracker does its thing.
Okay. So what do we need?
We need a game service. And I might as well create a null one.
Okay.
And no, actually, we're going to need to use the constructor. No, are we? No, I don't think we do. And then we're going to say track saves. And we could say track output or track something else, but I tend to be explicit about what we're tracking.
I like that.
And that's going to return an output tracker
of something. It's going to be our game?
Yep.
Okay. And then
I would usually call that games, just games, or saved games, or game saves, or something like that.
Okay. So that's
Maybe game tracker is better. Or save tracker.
Save tracker?
I like save tracker.
Okay, yeah.
And then we're going to assert that, and then we're going to do the save, or do the start.
Game service.start. And then we're going to say save.
And we'll assert that the game save tracker has one game in it.
Save tracker. Okay. Has size 1.
Well, let's assert that it has the actual game in it.
Okay.
So I guess this is going to double as a test of what's in there. New game, right? Is that a reference? Is that does the dot equals on that?
That's going to do a dot equals, which is going to compare it based on its
the content
state, which
Okay,
is
good.
technically not right for an entity, but that's okay for now.
Yeah.
All right, so this is going to fail because we haven't defined our track saves yet. So this will be a null pointer exception. Yep. Oops. And then we can output track.
No.
Oops.
No, we need to make an output listener that is created upon construction.
I always get these
output
mixed up.
listener.create. Oh, is it not output listener.create? I don't remember now.
Let's see. No, it's. I forget how. I just want to see how we used it. Oh, we did it up here.
Yeah, it's just new output listener.
Yeah. So we could. Do you prefer to do it in the constructor or in declaration?
No preference.
So I'm going to do it in declaration. Okay. That's our listener. I lost our method. Oops. What we want. Okay.
Okay. That should fail saying it's empty.
Correct. Yeah. It should say it does not contain the thing we wanted.
Yeah, Astrid, I used to think that, but
that's the way. That's the reason I do it. Is when you have 10 different test classes, the idea is to make it more visible that the classes that you're either trying to test too much distantly or that the class is too big. Whether that actually works, I don't know.
The problem I have with that is sometimes I will have like let's say I've got a class that does some parsing, and maybe let me take an example. HTTP request. I've got one method that returns the request body, another method that returns the request body parsed as form data. That parsed as form data might be 8 tests, right? Because it's doing parsing logic, and I'm going to have lots of different tests around that. And sometimes I'll put that as just 8 one-liners in a single test, but sometimes I'll have it as 8 tests. Mm-hmm. And I have noticed that as time has gone on, I've gotten more verbose in my tests. Mm-hmm. It used to be a 1-to-1 ratio between test code and production code, but now it's not. Now I've got a lot more test code than production code. And for that reason, but the production code is actually still quite compact, but the test code can be really long.
Right.
And so for that reason, I don't think I agree. I'm looking more at the size of the production code than the size of the test code when I'm deciding whether or not the production code needs to be split or not.
Yeah, in my experience, people don't look at the size of production code at all anyway, so I'm not sure it makes a difference to try and call it out from tests.
Yeah, I'm not worrying about what other people do because they're going to do crap anyway. I mean, yeah.
All right. So Suiji asks, helper assertion that compares based on the snapshot. That might be required later. We'll see. So this fails because we're not doing anything in our start.
Yeah.
So if we go back, let me take this track saves and move it up. So do you put your track saves above or below your create? No, it gets here. That's good enough. So now we want to say
listener
dot emit game.
Yeah,
that should
work,
assuming our equals works. Yep,
and it does. So I think we've got time to toss a few more of these in here. But yeah, we probably do want a helper method. Let's do a little helper method that just says, actually, no, let's wait. We might want to do more stuff with GameService than we're doing now.
So we've got starts, and now we want roll dice. So this going to be the same.
Why don't you copy the whole thing, replace line 16 with roll dice and see what happens. I think what's going to happen is that our contains isn't going to work because it's going to have different things in it.
Mm-hmm. So the game should be unequal. Null pointer exception.
I did not expect that.
I did not expect that either. Oh, because we didn't start.
Right, and there's some implicit state.
Well,
roll dice because not loading.
It is loading.
Then it should be loading from the null database.
But we're using with the delete me. That's why. So we could do create and pass that in.
Yeah. So no, let's just, we have to do what we did in all of our other game service tests, which is call new game service rather than calling GameService.create null, which is only for consumers of game service anyway. So let's just do that. Yes, technically we could use create, but that feels like where it's against the spirit of what that method is for.
Yeah. So and then we want the game database, which is game database. Great. Oh. Okay.
There we go. Oh, wait, no, it's expecting. Oh, right. That's failing because we're not actually.
Right, because it's empty.
Emitting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're not emitting.
So we can go ahead and emit.
Now, do we do the emit in the execute and save, or do we do it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, we do it in execute and save.
But doesn't that mean that when we write a test for reroll, it'll just work?
Yep. I don't have a problem with that.
So you'll have a test that doesn't fail.
Yeah.
So my tendency would be wait until I have a test fails where moving that into the execute and save, but
this is clearly the right spot for it. I don't want to do bad design just because it's not, just because a test won't fail down the road.
Okay.
Besides, our test will still fail because there'll be setup issues.
Right. So now it's failing. These things are hard to compare.
It's effectively failing because we've rolled a bunch of ones.
Right, because we've actually rolled, we have a current hand, and the new game certainly does not have that. Yeah.
Yeah. So what we need to do is say in roll dice save games, it's not going to compare to a new game. It's going to compare to an expected game.
Right. And this is where having the snapshot to game might be useful.
Having what?
So basically having, so we can create a snapshot with that and then compare it that way.
Yeah, let me type away for a minute, if that's all right.
Are you connected?
I am not connected. I've gotten disconnected again. I swear I connected just 30 minutes ago.
You did. I saw you.
Yeah, so I'm not going to type away. But yeah, let's compare it to expected game. Die roller.create null on line 31 will pass in some dice. And then we'll make a game and roll the dice on that with the same dice. I don't think we need to do the snapshot in this case.
I'm sorry, I was modifying that and you said something that did not register. So we're going to create a game.
Yeah.
Expected game. New game. And then what do we want to do? We want to do
expected game dot roll dice. Or dice
rolled,
I guess.
And then that's hand of dice of that.
Yeah.
That all.
This is the pattern I call collaborator-based isolation, by the way, in that we don't care how game works. We just care that the behavior we get is the same. It's sort of how you have sociable tests that have mocked out the call without worrying about, without actually mocking it out.
All right. Yep.
Yeah, names are hard. Sweegie.
So we're running up against time. Do we want to pause here?
Yeah, I think this is the place to stop for the day. Is it so? Everything's working, right?
Yes. Let me run all the tests.
Actually, are you okay going about 10 minutes longer?
I am, but I also want to make sure that Suiji's suggestion from way back was noted.
Which suggestion was that?
So I'll find it again.
The reason I don't want to stop here, Ted, is because we currently have some code stash, and I worry that we'll come back to this and we'll completely forget what's going on. But I know we are moments away from finishing this output tracking stuff. So I was thinking we could finish that, check it in, and then pop our stash and stop there.
So I put that into chat.
Okay.
Maybe
earlier. I'll address that while you keep on going.
Yep.
I do wonder if it's. No, probably not. Just thinking about factoring out a test helper, but it just seems like such a pain. So yeah. Oh yeah, I did see that. I think that comment, Suiji, was about what you'd like to see us do as our next topic.
Yes.
Our next stream, right? Thanks, Astrid. Glad you could join us.
All right, Astrid, take care.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea, Suiji. Ted and I will have to talk it over. Personally, I am like so sick of working with Spring. Every time we do something with Spring, um, uh, it's painful. So I'm not really excited about doing more Spring stuff, but Ted might be able to talk me into it.
Oh, I think I'm fine not.
Not doing more Spring.
No, mainly because I know how painful it can be, and I think other stuff could be more interesting.
Yeah.
Let's see. So 3, 2, 1. Oops. So that's the keep. And so we expect the game.
GameService.reroll doesn't roll the first 5 dice, does it?
Reroll?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
On line 59?
it it will keep the ones you specified as keep and then roll enough to flesh out a full hand.
Right. So I guess what I'm saying is that die roller has too many rolls on it.
Um,
In fact, those first 5 dice need to be passed into the game database snapshot.
yeah, so it depends on what we're doing here, right? Because the game database will not hold on to those. We're just checking the reroll. So actually, right. So this is where we want that snapshot convenience method. So yes.
If you pull out that snapshot, Ted,
Yeah.
we can modify line 70 to be game.from snapshot.
Yeah, let's do that. What? That was weird. Okay. So the re-rolled. So this doesn't matter. It's just going to be this. And so this is... Right. This is... this is the actual hand of dice.
It's a list of kept dice. Or no?
No, at this level, it's the list of kept dice. Here, it's just... here's the new hand. And so this is what we would expect, which is...
Oh, so GameService is the one who's actually doing the replacement, not the game.
Yeah, so...
That feels like a...
Because it's the one that has the knowledge of the randomness.
Right.
So...
Line 68 needs to be game.from snapshot.
That's why we did that.
Should be game.from.
Yeah, I don't know why it didn't complete. Okay.
Okay, why have we run out of die rolls? Line 82 coming from line 66. It's happening when we're calling GameService.
We kept 2. Oh,
We kept 2, which means we're rolling 3.
we need one more. And if we're kept it, then this should be 5, 4, 6, which is what it should have complained about. Yes. There we go.
Yeah.
Wow, that was
A little painful.
a little painful. Yeah.
I do note that even though we wrote this as, we're testing the tracker, what we're really doing here is we're testing all the logic, which is interesting. Is that it? Have we done all of the things that can save?
Let's see. So we did, the last one is assign current hand to.
Okay.
So this one, we can pretty much do all this. This gives us with a hand, the round is not completed. And then we do game service. So current hand to score category.
Straight.
And straight. And here, this is just create null. And then our expected gain.
Yeah, I guess it gets assigned to the scoreboard, doesn't it?
Yes. So we'll need to.
So it's the same thing, game.from the configured snapshot. And then we're just going to call assign current hand to on it, and that should be everything.
Yep. I'm amazed that worked. I just want to.
I do wonder. Yeah. I do wonder if there's some refactoring that could be done to make these tests less verbose.
I think we could probably figure that out. Yeah.
Yeah. But let's check this in and then pop our stack and then call it a day.
Yep.
So we've added GameService.track saves.
Is that okay?
In GameService, I would say.
All right.
Yep, works for me.
Good point, Pellet. And actually, James should also hawk his wares as well, because I know you've got an upcoming.
Yeah. So 3 weeks from now, my Testing Without Mocks training course is happening. We've got a great set of people signed up. Got 11 people signed up right now. I've talked to almost all of them. Or actually, I think I've talked to all of them. And these are all folks who are senior folks who are keenly interested in what's on the cutting edge of test automation. So should be a great group of people to be in a course with. I think it's going to be a fantastic course. Anyway, if you're interested in that, it's coming up on April 11th and 12th. And I don't remember what the command is in Ted's thing. Is it Nullables, Ted?
I forget. There's
Yes, that's
yeah,
it. Anyway,
okay.
jamesshore.com/s/nullables-training
There it goes.
will get you to the sign up page.
So let's merge. What do we do here? Oh, I shouldn't have renamed that. All right.
Oh, you renamed it.
My bad. That's all right. So that's our new method. Oh, that was the... oh, we didn't rename the snapshot, so we'll take that. And that's... That was just moved. That was just a rename. Let's run it. What's that? Change that change. So, yeah. So that one I'm going to...
So the material is going to be language agnostic, and I'm going to have office hours after every session where you're going to bring in your own code if you want. Those are optional. But during the course, the exercises are going to be in either JavaScript or TypeScript. It's going to be your choice on that one.
Oh, that's messed up. All right, I'll have to fix that manually.
With that rename. I didn't even think about it.
I didn't either. All right, so now this is snapshot. Snapshot.
And game database.
Game database.
Wait, we've got two
that one goes
save
away.
games. That's not right.
Yep. And that's fine. That's fine. So now we should have some broken tests.
I'm not sure if we do. Is it?
Well, because this is create null. I can change this back to the new data, new delete me.
Got it.
But maybe I'll leave it.
Yeah, I think put both of them in there. Just one commented out, so it's not too confusing for us.
Let's do that. So this is new delete me.
So that should now pass everything, right?
That should now pass, yes. Cool. All right.
Okay. Yeah, so if you could uncomment the one that makes the test fail, that will tell us where to continue next time. And I think you had some wares to hawk. Okay.
Yes. TDD cards, my TDD card game.
Right. I've been seeing you tweet about that. I'm very intrigued by this.
It's so I previously had the print and play version, but finally put it into physical production and did an unboxing of it, and it's sweet. It's nice. So I'm basically gonna open up for production orders. It's really expensive to print this stuff. Like in terms of like non-volume, it's basically like really expensive until you pretty much get to like 500 copies, which I will never. Yeah. I will be surprised if I get anywhere close to that. But it's really fun. And it's just really cool to see like, printed everything and nice UV coding and all that kind of stuff. So if you go to tdd.cards, I'm going to open up sales this week for the production pre-order. And it takes about like 8 to 10 weeks to print. So once you order, expect that it'll take a month or two to print.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think I know which service you're using. I use the same service for my Agile Fluency game. And yeah, I charge $495 for that game. It's a big box with lots of stuff in it.
Yeah.
And people are always surprised that it's so expensive because they're used to like buying Settlers of Catan for $60 at the game store.
Yes, but they print like 10,000 copies of those.
Yeah, I mean, and also it's mass market. There's lots more people buying them.
Yes.
So yeah, the cost of these things is not, what it costs to manufacture. It's the creativity and effort that goes into it, and the costs are higher for us.
Yeah.
But if you're using the same service I do, they do really good quality. Like it's good quality.
Yeah. The only thing I was unhappy with is the hex tiles get printed on these slugs, and they're laser cut, which means great precise cuts, except you end up with soot all over your hands.
Yeah, it does wipe off. Like,
yeah, and so so I can't actually have them ship it directly to people. I'm gonna have to rebox it, because the box that can actually hold it is much smaller than the slugs itself. Plus, I kind of don't want people to have soot on their hands, so I'm willing to take the extra little bit of time, maybe employ my son to basically pop them out and wipe them off, so people get a nice, he needs to earn some money, so he can do that.
You're more generous than I am. I just ship it to the people who buy it.
Well, it's also try to reduce the cost, because the minimum the small box, what's called the medium box size, won't hold it. And so then they'll basically ship it separately, which increases the cost of shipping. It just increased the cost like by $10. And so I don't want to do that. Plus, I was unhappy with some of the parts that they included. I thought that they were pretty poor quality, so I'm probably going to source some of those separately. So this is definitely, for me, a labor of love, not a money maker, based at the price I'm selling it at, which still it'll be $90, which still is, perhaps expensive when you compare it to Seven Wonders or any of those games. But for me, it's more like I want it to be accessible. I want people to have fun and basically foster discussion around TDD, and it seems to do that for the people who've bought the one where you print your own.
Well, I really look forward to seeing how it turns out when I get a copy. Final thoughts on the stuff we did today, Ted?
What did we do today?
we ended up spending a lot more time trying to get the database stuff factored in than I expected. Like,
Same
that's
here.
still not done.
Yeah.
And I was not expecting that.
Yeah, I was not expecting that either.
And my experience with Nullables is they're kind of a drop-in replacement for your existing tests. It's usually not this hard. And so trying to figure out.
So I think what was interesting is mainly because there were a bunch of tests that were expecting a fake.
Yeah.
That was really
and the thing is when I've used Nullables to replace existing tests, I've only done it with mocks.
Right.
And they are just a drop-in replacement for mocks, because the semantics are the same.
Right.
You've got the tracker for the spying.
Yep.
And you've got the configurable responses for the setup.
Yeah.
It's the fact that it's a fake that's really causing us the problem here.
Yeah. And what's interesting, and I thought that was, despite the fact that it was sort of annoying and painful, it did sort of demonstrate to me that I may be over relying on fakes when I don't need to. So I'm gonna. So that's sort of my take home message for the day is: do I really need a fake here, or do I just need basically a stub?
Yeah. Well, and I think we were a little bit masochistic as well, in that we could have very easily gone into our game database and changed that embedded stub into an embedded fake.
Right.
And it would have instantly made everything work.
Yeah.
But you made a really good point early on, and you repeated it as well, is that what we discovered is that our tests were acting at as a distance.
Right.
And that wasn't necessarily great tests.
Yeah.
And we've just added a whole bunch of tests of our stuff that act on the game, that test that the game is really being acted upon. And those tests I don't think existed before. So I'm happy that those exist.
Yeah.
And I think if I were doing it from scratch, I probably would have also asserted that the game database saw the save happen as well. Right. Which honestly wouldn't be that much work. It'd just be another tracker and another assert.
Yeah.
But all right. Well, that was extra long stream for you all today to make up for the 20 minutes of rebooting in the middle.
I'll reboot twice next time. Maybe that'll fix it.
Yeah. Well, better reboot 3 times just to be safe.
All right. Reboot 3 times. All right, folks. So as we said a couple of times, we're trying to figure out, once we sort of complete this stuff, what's of interest, what should we spend our time on stream doing next. So you can find us on the usual social media, and as well as our respective Discords. So send us your thoughts.
Yeah. Ted is JitterTed, at JitterTed on Twitter and Mastodon. I'm at James Shore on Twitter and Mastodon. And look forward to hearing your thoughts.
All right, folks, have a good one.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.